The distant crack of a rifle echoed across the treacherous no-man's land near Sevastopol, a sound that had become as familiar to the soldiers in the trenches as their own heartbeats. But this particular shot, followed by 7 agonizing seconds of silence, marked the end of an extraordinary duel that had lasted for 3 days. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a young woman with steady hands and an unflinching gaze, peered through her scope at a target nearly a mile away. The general, who had been watching through his binoculars from a command post, had called out a simple question just minutes before. "Any snipers?" He was referring to the German marksmen who had been pinning down their platoon, killing 3 men and making movement impossible during daylight hours. Pavlichenko didn't answer with words. She answered with action, though not without struggle. 8 times she had squeezed the trigger, and 8 times the bullet had found nothing but dirt and rock. And the enemy sniper was good, perhaps the best she had ever faced. But now, as the dust settled nearly 4,200 meters away, the general lowered his binoculars and watched the German position fall silent. What he didn't know was that this woman, this unassuming former history student from Kiev, had just accomplished what most trained marksmen would consider impossible. And she had done it by understanding something that no scope could measure. This is her story, a tale of patience, precision, and the kind of quiet determination that changes the course of history, one bullet at a time. Before she became the most lethal female sniper in history, before she was nicknamed Lady Death by the enemies who feared her, Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko was simply a girl from a small Ukrainian town who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to place upon her. She was born on July 12, 1916, in Bila Tserkva, a city south of Kiev, into a Russian family that valued hard work and education. Her father was a factory worker from St. Petersburg, and her mother worked as a teacher, instilling in young Lyudmila a love for learning that would stay with her throughout her life. But there was something else about her, something that set her apart from other girls her age. She was, by her own admission, a complete tomboy, fiercely competitive and determined to prove that she could do anything the boys could do, often better. When Lyudmila was 14, her family moved to the bustling city of Kiev, a transition that could have overwhelmed a less resilient spirit. Instead, she embraced the opportunities that city life offered. She enrolled in school and threw herself into various activities, but it was a chance encounter with a local shooting club that would ultimately shape her destiny. The club was part of Unassuming, a paramilitary training organization that taught civil defense and marksmanship skills to Soviet citizens. Lyudmila picked up a rifle for the first time and discovered something remarkable. She had a natural talent for shooting, an innate ability to steady her breathing, focus her vision, and place a bullet exactly where she wanted it to go. It wasn't long before she earned her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge and a marksman certificate, honors that recognized her as an exceptional amateur shooter. But life, even for a sharpshooting tomboy, was complicated. At around 16 years old, Lyudmila married a doctor and gave birth to a son, whom she named Rostislav. The marriage, however, was short-lived and ended in divorce, leaving her as a young single mother in a society that offered few easy paths for women in her situation. Undeterred, she worked during the day as a grinder at the Kiev arsenal factory, grinding metal in a noisy industrial plant, and attended night school to complete her education. It was an exhausting existence, working with her hands by day and exercising her mind by night, but Lyudmila was never one to shy away from hard work. In 1937, she achieved a significant milestone by enrolling at Kiev University, where she studied history with the intention of becoming a scholar and teacher. She joined the university's track team, competing as a sprinter and pole vaulter, and continued to hone her shooting skills through Red Army training courses. Few who saw her on campus, running laps or carrying books to class, could have imagined the path that lay ahead. She was a history student, a mother, an athlete, but beneath that unassuming exterior, the skills of a warrior were quietly developing, waiting for the moment when her country would need her most. That moment arrived in June 1941, when Lyudmila was 24 years old and just months away from completing her history degree. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that caught Stalin and the Red Army dangerously unprepared. The Wehrmacht swept across the border in a relentless tide, crushing everything in its path and driving deep into Soviet territory. When Lyudmila heard the news in Kiev, she didn't hesitate. She gathered her things and made her way to the local recruiting office, determined to enlist and fight for her homeland. The recruiter took one look at the young woman standing before him and immediately tried to steer her toward a more traditional role. "Why not become a nurse?" he suggested, "or perhaps take a clerical position, something safe and appropriate for a woman." But Lyudmila had not come to file papers or change bandages. She reached into her pocket and produced her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge and her marksman certificate, proof that she was not just any woman asking for a rifle, but a trained shooter with documented skills. The recruiter examined the documents, looked at the determined young woman standing before him, and reluctantly signed her up for the infantry. She was assigned to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division, specifically the 54th Stepan Razin Rifle Regiment, and given the designation of private. Despite her training, the Red Army was desperately short of weapons in those chaotic early days of the invasion, and when she first arrived at her unit, she was issued nothing more than a fragmentation grenade. It was hardly the tool of a sniper, but Lyudmila waited patiently, knowing that her opportunity would come. On August 8th, 1941, that opportunity arrived in the most brutal way imaginable. During a skirmish near Odessa, the fallen comrade handed her his Mosin Nagant model 1891 bolt-action rifle, the standard weapon of Soviet infantrymen. Lyudmila took the rifle, found a position, and through her scope, she saw two enemy soldiers for the first time. She later described this moment as her baptism of fire. She squeezed the trigger once, then again, and watched as both men fell. She had killed her first enemies, and in doing so, she had proven to herself and to her comrades that she belonged on the front lines. But there was no celebration, no moment of triumph. This was war, and killing, even of enemies, left its mark. But Lyudmila understood something crucial about survival. She told herself that she wasn't killing people, she was neutralizing targets. It was war, she would later explain. That made it easier. The siege of Odessa became Lyudmila's proving ground. For 2.5 months, she operated in the no-man's land between Soviet and Romanian lines, and often advancing far ahead of her own troops to find the perfect firing position. She lay motionless for hours in mud and weeds, enduring heat and cold, mosquitoes and rain, waiting for an enemy to appear in her crosshairs. When she squeezed the trigger, she aimed not just to wound, but to kill, because a wounded soldier would be evacuated, while a dead soldier was simply gone. Day by day, the tally grew. 10 kills, 20, 50. By the time she was promoted to senior sergeant in August 1941, she had recorded 100 confirmed kills. When the siege finally ended, and her unit was evacuated by sea to Sevastopol in October, her count stood at an astonishing 187 enemy soldiers killed. She had entered the war as a history student with a rifle. She was emerging as one of the deadliest snipers in the Red Army, though the cost of that transformation was only beginning to reveal itself. Sevastopol was different from Odessa. The fighting was more intense, the stakes higher, and the danger more personal in ways Lyudmila had never anticipated. During the siege of this strategic Crimean port, she met another sniper, a man named Alexei Kitsenko, and despite the chaos of war all around them, they fell in love. They married quickly, as soldiers do when every day might be their last, and for a brief, precious time, Lyudmila experienced a happiness she had not known since before her first marriage ended. She and Alexei fought side by side, spotting for each other. She covering each other's positions, sharing the unique bond of warriors who trust each other with their lives. But Sevastopol was a meat grinder, and the meat grinder showed no mercy. In the spring of 1942, Alexei was manning a position when a German mortar shell landed nearby. The explosion caught him with shrapnel, tearing into his body and leaving him mortally wounded. Lyudmila dragged him to shelter, applied tourniquets, and did everything she could to save him. But his injuries were too severe. He died in her arms a few days later in the hospital, leaving her alone again, but this time with a grief that cut far deeper than any bullet wound. The war had taken her husband, and the pain of that loss would stay with her for the rest of her life, feeding a depression that she would never fully escape. But grief, for a soldier on the front lines, is a luxury that cannot be afforded. There were enemies to kill and a battle to fight. And so Lyudmila swallowed her pain and returned to her position. Her kill count continued to climb, passing 250 by May 1942 and earning her a promotion to lieutenant. Among her kills were no fewer than 36 enemy snipers, each one the result of a deadly duel that could last hours or even days. These were the most dangerous engagements a sniper could face, two hunters stalking each other across the shattered landscape, each knowing that the first mistake would be the last. Lyudmila never lost a duel. She had learned to read the terrain, to anticipate an enemy's thinking, to wait with the patience of a predator until her target made one move too many, as she put it. Her reputation grew so formidable that the German army took notice. They tried to bribe her first, broadcasting messages over loudspeakers that promised chocolate and a commission as a German officer if she would defect. When she ignored those offers, the tone changed. "If we catch you," the loudspeakers blared, "we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds." Far from frightening her, Lyudmila found a grim satisfaction in the threat. It meant they knew her record. It meant they feared her. And in the arithmetic of war, fear was a weapon as powerful as any rifle. But no soldier, no matter how skilled, is immune to the randomness of battle. In June 1942, while fighting in Sevastopol, Lyudmila was caught in a mortar barrage. Shrapnel from an exploding round struck her in the face, tearing into her flesh and leaving her bleeding and disoriented. She was evacuated by submarine, one of the last to leave the besieged city before it fell to the Germans, and spent a month in a hospital recovering from her wounds. By the time she was released, her official confirmed kill count stood at 309, a number that made her not just the most successful female sniper in Soviet history, but one of the most lethal snipers of any gender in the entire war. Her fighting days were over. The Soviet High Command, recognizing her value as a symbol rather than a soldier, ordered her to remain away from the front. She would never fire a shot in combat again, but her war was far from over. A different kind of battle awaited her, one that would require every bit of her courage and determination. The Soviet Union needed help. The Red Army was suffering catastrophic losses, and Stalin was desperate for the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe, to force Germany to fight on two fronts and relieve the pressure on the East. To build support for this cause, the Soviets sent a delegation to the United States and Canada, and at its center was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, now promoted to major and decorated with the nation's highest honors. In August 1942, she arrived in Washington, D.C., becoming the first Soviet citizen ever received at the White House. Her First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt welcomed her warmly, and the two women formed an immediate and lasting friendship that transcended the political tensions between their nations. But if the White House was welcoming, the American press was anything but. Reporters seemed far more interested in Lyudmila's appearance than in her combat experience. They called her the girl sniper in headlines, as if her gender was more newsworthy than her 309 kills. One reporter criticized the length of her uniform skirt, claiming that American women wore shorter skirts and that her outfit made her look fat. Another asked whether Soviet women were allowed to wear makeup on the front lines, a question so absurd that Lyudmila struggled to take it seriously. "Who had time to think of her shiny nose when there is a battle going on?" she responded. The questions were demeaning, trivializing, and infuriating, but Lyudmila, or who had endured months of trench warfare and the death of her husband, refused to be dismissed. Accompanied by Eleanor Roosevelt, she traveled across the United States, speaking to crowds of thousands in New York, Chicago, and other cities. She stood before factory workers, union members, and students, describing in stark, unadorned language what it meant to fight and kill and watch your friends die. In Chicago, addressing a crowd that was overwhelmingly male, she delivered a line that would become legendary. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and her gaze unwavering, "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" For a moment there was silence. Then the crowd erupted, roaring its approval, and Lyudmila knew that her message had finally broken through. She was not a curiosity or a novelty, she was a soldier, and she had come to remind Americans that there was a war to be won. From the United States, she traveled to Canada, where thousands greeted her at Toronto's Union Station, and she was presented with a Winchester Model 70 rifle equipped with a telescopic sight. She visited England, touring factories in Coventry and Birmingham and accepting donations from workers to purchase medical equipment for the Red Army. Everywhere she went, she spoke with the same blunt honesty, and refusing to sugarcoat the horrors of war or the urgency of the Allied cause. She inspired folk singer Woody Guthrie to write a song in her honor, Miss Pavlichenko, which celebrated her courage and her contribution to the fight against fascism. But despite all her efforts, the second front she had come to advocate for would not open until 1944, 2 years after her tour. By then, millions more would die, but Lyudmila had done everything in her power to prevent those deaths. She returned to the Soviet Union a hero, but also a woman forever changed by what she had seen and done. The war ended in 1945, but for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the peace was not an easy one. She returned to Kiev University and completed her history degree, finally achieving the academic goal she had set for herself before the war interrupted everything. She took a position as a research assistant with the Soviet Navy, in a role that allowed her to contribute to her country's defense without carrying a rifle. On the surface, she had built a new life, respectable and productive, the kind of life that a scholar and war hero deserved. But beneath the surface, the wounds of war continued to bleed. Lyudmila struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, the psychological aftermath of years spent killing and watching others die. She had lost her husband Alexei in the most brutal way imaginable, and the grief of that loss never fully healed. She turned to alcohol to numb the pain, a coping mechanism that only compounded her suffering and damaged her health. Depression, heavy and persistent, became her constant companion, a darkness that no amount of medals or honors could dispel. She had killed 309 men, and that knowledge, no matter how justified by war, weighed on her soul in ways that those who had never fired a shot could not understand. In 1957, 15 years after their first meeting, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Moscow and insisted on seeing her old friend. The Cold War had descended, freezing relations between their countries, and Soviet authorities were reluctant to allow the former First Lady to visit a military hero. But Roosevelt was as determined as Pavlichenko herself, and eventually, permission was granted. Now, the two women spent time together in Lyudmila's small Moscow apartment, slipping away from their attendants to laugh and reminisce about the summer they had spent traveling across America. For a few precious hours, Lyudmila was not a sniper or a symbol, but simply a woman reconnecting with a friend, and that brief respite from the weight of her past must have felt like a gift beyond measure. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko died on October 10, 1974, at the age of 58, suffering a stroke that finally ended a life marked by extraordinary achievement and profound pain. She was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, one of the most prestigious resting places in the nation, and her son, Rostislav, was later buried beside her. The Soviet Union honored her memory with commemorative postage stamps, and she was remembered as a military hero, the most successful female sniper in history, a woman who had defended her homeland with skill and courage beyond measure. But those who knew her best understood that her legacy was more complex than the official narrative suggested. She had given everything to her country, her youth, her education, her husband, her peace of mind, and in return she had received honors that could not heal her wounds and recognition that could not quiet her demons. The story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko is not simply a story of killing, though 309 confirmed kills is a number that demands attention. It is a story of a woman who refused to accept the limits that others tried to place upon her, who proved in the most extreme circumstances imaginable that courage and skill have no gender. It is a story of love and loss, of grief endured and duty fulfilled, of a history student who became a warrior, and a warrior who spent the rest of her life trying to find peace. And it is a story that ends with a question that has no easy answer. When we celebrate heroes, when we honor those who fight and kill in our names, do we also remember the price they pay? Do we recognize that the courage that saves us can also destroy the one who bears it? Lyudmila Pavlichenko saved lives with every enemy she killed, but in the end, she could not save herself. That is the tragedy hidden within the triumph, and it is a truth that we ignore at our peril.